Paul Heyman exposes Seth Rollins' backstage plot against Roman Reigns. Did Seth Rollins orchestrate the brutal backstage ambush on Roman Reigns? In this explosive expose, Paul Heyman breaks his silence and unveils the shocking truth behind the attack that shook WWE RAW. Watch as secrets unfold, alliances crumble, and the future of the Bloodline and Monday Night Raw hangs in the balance. This is not your typical backstage segment, this is war. Under the dim flicker of red hallway lights backstage at WWE RAW, chaos erupted with a violence so calculated, so precise, that it left even the most seasoned WWE superstars shaken. The tribal chief, Roman Reigns, had been ambushed. Not in the ring, not on camera, but in the narrow, cold corridors of the arena, where concrete meets silence and trust often dies. It was not just a beatdown. It was a statement. And in the hours that followed, when the cameras had stopped rolling and the crowd had filed out into the night, only one man dared to speak the truth. Paul Heyman. For weeks, Heyman had stayed silent. Watching. Waiting. Surviving. He knew better than anyone how these things worked. He had seen alliances form and shatter. He had built empires and orchestrated downfalls with nothing more than whispered words. But this betrayal, this backstage ambush on Roman Reigns, it had crossed a line even he dared not touch. Until now. The world saw the aftermath. Roman Reigns sprawled across the concrete floor, his signature vest torn, blood smeared across his face. Trainers and referees frantically called for medics. Commentators spoke in hushed tones. WWE's social media team clipped only fragments of the footage, their captions vague, their hashtags careful. But what they didn't show, what they couldn't show, was the truth behind the attack. And it was Paul Heyman who knew exactly where that truth was buried. At first, he refused interviews. He deflected questions. When asked whether Solo Sikoa or Jacob Fatu might have gone rogue, Heyman responded with non-answers, "Let's wait for Roman to speak," or "The Bloodline is evaluating its next move." But late one night, in a private pre-taped segment that was never aired in full, Heyman finally looked directly into the camera. And what he said shook the very core of WWE. Seth Rollins, he muttered, was never finished with Roman Reigns. The words lingered in the air like a confession. But it was only the beginning. Because what Heyman revealed next wasn't just a backstage rumor or a theory. It was a carefully traced web of deception, a plot seeded in the aftermath of WrestleMania and nurtured in the shadows of Raw's most chaotic episodes. Rewind to the weeks leading up to the ambush. Seth Rollins had been quiet. Too quiet. Nursing a nagging injury, claiming recovery time, stepping away from in-ring action. To the public, he was recuperating. To insiders, he was planning. And according to Heyman, those plans began the night Roman Reigns retained his position as tribal chief by defeating Cody Rhodes in what many believed would be his final test. Backstage, Seth watched. Not with disappointment, but with calculation. He waited, Heyman said, for the moment Roman would feel untouchable. That's when Seth always strikes. Heyman's voice trembled, not with fear, but with regret. For once, he wasn't the mastermind. He hadn't seen it coming. Or perhaps he had, and simply didn't want to admit it. After all, Rollins and Heyman had a history. A complicated one. At times, Rollins had been Heyman's project. Other times, his adversary. But this time, it was different. According to Heyman, Seth Rollins wasn't working alone. He was building something. A new alliance. One rooted not in family, like the Bloodline, but in vengeance. In retribution. And in raw, unchecked ambition. Heyman described quiet meetings in locker rooms with the doors closed and the windows blacked out. He spoke of hushed conversations between Seth and superstars with reasons to hate Roman Reigns, stars who had been exiled, passed over, embarrassed, or beaten by the tribal chief. Superstars like Bronson Reed. Like Damian Priest. Like Sami Zayn. People with chips on their shoulders and something to prove. It wasn't about titles. It wasn't even about power. It was about dismantling the myth of Roman Reigns piece by piece. Heyman, always the observer, started noticing patterns. Talent showing up where they shouldn't. Security footage wiped clean. Locker room assignments mysteriously shuffled. And Roman? Roman had let his guard down. For the first time in years, he walked the halls of Raw like a man without enemies. Like a king without fear. That was his mistake. On the night of the attack, Reigns had arrived late to the arena. His private plane had been delayed due to a storm over Atlanta. He skipped the production meeting. He went straight to his dressing room. No cameras. No shield. Just Reigns, a coffee in hand, headphones over his ears, his team scattered across the building. And that's when it happened. According to Heyman, the attackers were masked, but not silent. Reigns fought back. There was yelling. Crashing. The sound of flesh against concrete. But it wasn't a mugging. It was surgical. Brutal. Efficient. The kind of ambush that comes from inside knowledge. From someone who knew his schedule. His route. His habits. When WWE personnel finally reached the scene, Roman was unconscious. A broken steel chair lay nearby. His necklace, the symbol of his tribal chiefdom, was gone. Stolen. Or worse, used as a trophy. The arena's internal cameras had suffered a power surge minutes before. Nothing recorded. But Heyman had his sources. Sources inside the production truck. Sources in security. And what they told him was chilling. A voice. Distorted. Garbled. But unmistakable in its cadence. Laughing. Taunting. One phrase repeated over and over, "Kings fall hardest when they forget they're mortal." Heyman closed his eyes as he recounted the moment. He knew that voice. We all did. It was Seth Rollins. In the days that followed, Rollins made no public statement. No promo. No cryptic tweet. Just silence. But silence is not the absence of guilt, it's its loudest echo. Heyman, disturbed by what he knew, began connecting the dots. He returned to old emails. Text threads. Security footage from previous weeks. One clip in particular sent chills down his spine. Rollins, weeks earlier, backstage at Raw, ducking into a locker room that was supposed to be empty. Minutes later, Bronson Reed entered. The footage cut before they emerged. What were they planning? Heyman had his suspicions. The bloodline was crumbling. Solo Sikoa had become unpredictable. Jacob Fatu was nowhere to be seen. Jimmy Uso had disappeared. Roman, for the first time, stood without his full force behind him. And Seth Rollins knew it. But what disturbed Heyman most wasn't the plot, it was the motive. This wasn't about gold. It wasn't about who held the championship. It was personal. Deeply personal. Seth Rollins had never forgiven Roman Reigns for becoming the face of WWE while he was left in the shadows. For being crowned tribal chief while Seth was relegated to chaos bringer, lunatic, architect, everything but the heir. This was always going to happen, Heyman whispered. We just pretended it wouldn't. Heyman recounted the first time he warned Roman about Seth. It was months ago, after a tense promo on Raw where Rollins laughed a little too sincerely, where his eyes lingered a little too long on Roman's title. Reigns dismissed it. He's not a threat, Roman had said. He's finished. But Seth Rollins is never finished. He evolves. He adapts. And he waits. Heyman described him as a serpent lying in the weeds of WWE's chaos, slithering through alliances, waiting for just the right moment to strike. And this time, he didn't just strike Roman. He went for the heart of the kingdom. By exposing Seth's role in the attack, Heyman wasn't just spilling secrets, he was sending a warning. The war has begun, he said. And it's not just about Roman and Seth. It's about everyone who still believes in loyalty, in legacy, in family. Those values are being hunted. The WWE Universe erupted when Heyman's footage aired in fragments on Raw the following week. Some fans refused to believe it. Others pieced together their own conspiracy theories. But the tension backstage was undeniable. Superstars whispered in hallways. Producers tightened security. Roman, still recovering, remained absent. And Seth? Still no comment. The silence, as Heyman predicted, was his loudest weapon. But something else lingered beneath Heyman's testimony. A shadow of guilt. He had been the voice behind the curtain for too long. Had he enabled this war by playing both sides? Had his silence paved the way for Seth's betrayal? Or was he merely the last honest man in a kingdom built on secrets? Whatever the answer, one truth remained. Roman Reigns was ambushed. And Seth Rollins was no longer hiding. In the aftermath of Heyman's revelation, the tension within WWE didn't just rise, it exploded. The arena was no longer just a place for wrestling, it had become a battleground for whispered conspiracies and growing mistrust. Superstars exchanged glances laced with suspicion. Producers no longer shared run sheets freely. Even security details were reshuffled. The entire ecosystem of Raw was now infected by paranoia. And at the center of it all, a question lingered like smoke after a fire: why would Seth Rollins do this? To the public, Seth had always portrayed himself as an agent of chaos, a visionary, a revolutionary. But those close to him saw a different man. They saw a competitor who had never fully recovered from being cast aside when Roman was crowned tribal chief. A man who had played second fiddle in the Shield. A man who had watched Roman walk into WrestleMania after WrestleMania, main eventing, winning, being exalted as the leader not just of the Bloodline, but of WWE itself. Seth wasn't content being the architect anymore. According to Heyman, he was now building something far more dangerous, a counter-empire. Privately, WWE executives began conducting internal inquiries. Surveillance footage was reviewed again and again. A source from talent relations leaked that Seth had been seen entering production meetings he wasn't scheduled for. Another report surfaced claiming that Seth had personally requested a match change weeks before the attack, a match that was never aired. Why? Because it would have placed him backstage at the exact time Roman arrived. More chilling than the logistics, however, was the psychology. Heyman described it best: Seth doesn't rage. He plots. He calculates. He buries the knife long before anyone realizes he's holding it. In unseen footage recorded just days before the assault, Heyman confronted Seth Rollins in a dimly lit hallway. The clip, which was only briefly shown before being pulled from WWE's official channel, showed a rare moment of unfiltered tension. Heyman, voice tight with suspicion, asked, "What are you planning, Seth?" Rollins simply smiled and replied, "Something unforgettable." That smile, calm, cold, and deliberate, was not the expression of a man reacting to chaos. It was the face of the orchestrator. As the days unfolded, Heyman's position became even more precarious. Some within WWE management questioned his loyalty. Was he leaking too much? Was he protecting Roman, or covering for himself? After all, if Heyman truly knew everything that was going on, why didn't he warn Reigns before the attack? That's when the second shockwave hit. A new voice entered the conversation: Kevin Owens. In a surprise segment aired live on SmackDown, Owens took to the mic not with fury, but with clarity. "I warned Roman," he said. "I warned him that the war wasn't over. That Seth Rollins was never done." Owens claimed that weeks earlier, he had intercepted a conversation between Rollins and a top-tier NXT call-up, an anonymous figure who had allegedly been offered a role in history in exchange for loyalty to Seth. That call-up was never named, but suddenly eyes turned to Braun Breaker. Breaker had risen fast, too fast. And now, questions flooded the locker room. Was Breaker one of Seth's pawns? Heyman, when confronted with this intel, nodded slowly. "I knew Seth wasn't working alone," he said. But I never realized how deep his reach went. The truth, it seemed, was far more complex than a simple betrayal. Seth wasn't just targeting Roman. He was recruiting. Creating a silent uprising among the younger, overlooked, or undervalued stars. He had weaponized resentment and turned it into a faction, one that operated in the shadows, out of reach of the Bloodline's surveillance. This wasn't about winning matches. It was about rewriting the hierarchy. And perhaps no one understood that better than JUSO. Jay, long estranged from the inner workings of the Bloodline, emerged from silence to issue a cryptic warning. "The family ain't safe no more," he said in a backstage interview. "The walls we built? They're cracking." When asked directly if he believed Seth Rollins was behind the attack on Roman, Jay didn't answer. He just looked into the camera and whispered, "I know what betrayal feels like." In a moment of rare vulnerability, Heyman admitted to WWE Digital that he feared this war could not be won. Not with brute strength. Not with intimidation. Not even with Roman's return. "This isn't a fight," he said. "It's a reckoning." And that reckoning arrived in the form of a sealed envelope delivered to WWE headquarters, an official summons. Roman Reigns was demanding a confrontation. Not in court. Not in private. But live. In the ring. On Raw. The promo package aired that night was short, but it was enough to send chills down every spine in the arena. Grainy black and white footage of Roman's injuries faded into a voiceover. "You wanted war?" Roman's voice growled. "I'm coming to finish it." WWE scrambled to prepare. The return of the tribal chief was set for the following Monday. Seth Rollins had not responded publicly. Not yet. But a new wrinkle emerged. Rollins was now being flanked by figures in black hoodies. Faces covered. Silent. No introductions. Just shadows. Was this his new shield? Or something worse? Heyman's warnings continued. He appeared on the bump and delivered a chilling monologue. "Roman Reigns is not the man he once was. He's wounded. Betrayed. Cornered. And that makes him more dangerous than ever." But deep down, even Heyman knew this war wasn't just physical. It was psychological. It was spiritual. It was about legacy. For Seth, it was about stepping out of Roman's shadow once and for all. For Roman, it was about proving that his crown had not rusted, that he was still the tribal chief, with or without the Bloodline at his side. And for Heyman? It was survival. Pure and simple. The night of Roman's return arrived. The air in the arena was electric, buzzing with fear and excitement. The lights dimmed. The familiar heartbeat thumped through the speakers. The crowd rose. Roman Reigns stepped through the curtain. But he wasn't alone. Beside him, Jacob Fatu and Zilla Fatu. The crowd erupted. The camera cut to Seth Rollins backstage watching a monitor. His jaw clenched. His hand wrapped around the MITB briefcase like a weapon. His eyes, cold, unreadable. Heyman, from the commentary desk, said nothing. But his expression told the story. This wasn't over. Not even close. Because war had finally arrived on Monday Night Raw. And secrets, no matter how buried, were finally demanding to be heard. The confrontation that unfolded on that night, when Roman Reigns returned to Raw with Jacob Fatu and Zilla Fatu flanking him, was not scripted chaos. It was a declaration. A shot across the bow. The moment Roman stepped into that ring, every light in the arena felt hotter, every cheer more desperate, every breath more fragile. The silence before he spoke was deafening. And then, when he finally took the microphone and raised it to his lips, what came out wasn't bravado. It was a quiet, deliberate fire. "Seth," he began, "you forgot who I am." Those words echoed through the arena with the weight of a crown, not just a catchphrase. Roman Reigns, the man who had carried WWE through pandemics, through locker room fractures, through the Bloodline's rise and fall, was standing not as a victim, but as a survivor. A warrior scarred, but unbroken. His voice was rough, his demeanor shaken, but the cold clarity in his eyes revealed something terrifying. He wasn't here to plead. He wasn't here to forgive. He was here for war. Zilla Fatu and Jacob Fatu stood behind him like specters of the dynasty, silent, unmoving, but dangerous. Each man represented more than just muscle. They were legacy. They were blood. And perhaps most importantly, they were loyal. In contrast to the betrayal Reigns had suffered, these two warriors were a reminder that not all had turned against him. But what stunned the audience that night wasn't Roman's return, it was what happened after he finished speaking. As the arena lights flickered ominously, Seth Rollins appeared. Not from the entrance ramp. Not through the crowd. But from the rafters. Wearing all black, flanked by three masked figures, Seth descended slowly, a visual echo of Sting in his prime. The crowd roared, gasped, and then fell into a quiet, anticipatory hush. Seth stood on the upper deck balcony, looking down at Roman. He held no microphone. He simply smirked. And then, he raised the money in the bank briefcase high above his head. It wasn't a cash-in. It was a taunt. A promise. A warning. Roman didn't flinch. Instead, he tilted his head. Jacob Fatu stepped forward slightly, but Roman extended an arm, halting him. This wasn't the moment to strike. This was the moment to listen. Because then, Seth finally spoke. No more secrets, he said. No more shadows. You took everything I ever bled for. Now I'm taking everything you ever built. The lights cut out. And when they returned, Seth and his faction were gone. What followed in the days ahead was unlike anything WWE had seen since the early days of The Shield. A campaign of silence and strikes. Anonymous attacks backstage. Matches interrupted by masked figures. Promos hijacked by glitches that played distorted audio clips of Roman's old Shield promos, twisted, spliced, and perverted into threats. Paul Heyman, no longer at Roman's side, became the reluctant mouthpiece of these events. He appeared on WWE programming as a special commentator, but fans knew better. He was monitoring. Gathering. Surviving. And when he sat down with Kathy Kelly for a post-Raw sit-down interview, he looked older. Tired. Like a man who had finally understood the cost of walking between titans. What is this really about, Paul? She asked. And Heyman, with his hands clasped and his voice barely above a whisper, said, this isn't just about Seth and Roman. It's about who WWE belongs to now. He went on to explain that while Roman Reigns had reigned through fear and dominance, Seth Rollins was now leading through ideology. Through rebellion. Through disillusionment. Seth has turned WWE into his battlefield for justice, Heyman said. Only, justice, like truth, can be twisted. The irony wasn't lost on Heyman. He had once twisted the truth to serve the bloodline. Now, Seth was doing the same. But where Heyman had orchestrated in shadows, Seth was beginning to operate in plain sight. Then came the unmasking. 1 week after the balcony stunt, Seth Rollins opened Raw. No tricks. No ambush. Just a spotlight and a mic. He walked into the ring alone and called for his followers to join him,